Excel 2016, Chapter 5, pages 310 through 315. Okay, on page 310, just read briefly about creating a slicer to filter a pivot table. We've worked with slicers before, so you know what one is, so it'll just take you a quick second to go over that. To add the sales ID slicer to the pivot table, step number 1, on the ribbon, click the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. So we have Pivot Tables Tools, and there's your Analyze tab right there. Go ahead and click it. In the Filter group, so the first thing we're going to do is find our filter group. Click the Insert Slicer button. Insert Slicer, right there. The Insert Slicers dialog box opens, displaying a list of available pivot table fields. You can select any or all of the fields. Step number 3. Click the Sales ID checkbox to insert a check mark and then click the OK button. Don't hit Sales Date, we want Sales ID. Check and make sure you got Sales ID and not Sales Date, and then click OK. The Sales ID slicer appears on the worksheet. Because the pivot table is already filtered to display only the results for Sales ID 2, the 2 button is selected. The other slicer buttons are white because those weeks have been filtered and are not part of the pivot table. If the Slicer Tools Options tab does not appear on the ribbon, click the Sales ID slicer to select it. Okay, so this says Slicer Tools Options. If you happen to be clicked out, you wouldn't get it. You click on your slicer and you'll get the correct contextual tab with your options. Step number 5. On the Slicer Tools Option tab in the Size group. So we have Slicer Tools Options, right? And then we have our Size group right there. Change the height to 1.9 and change the width to 1.25. So height 1.9 and width 1.25. Right? The slicer object is resized, eliminating the extra space below the buttons and to the right of the labels. Step number 6. In the Slicer Styles group, okay, in our Slicer Styles group, click the More button and then click Slicer Style Dark 6. So here's our More button, and we want dark, and our table's green, so I'm assuming this is going to be it. Slicer Style Dark 6. Okay, go ahead and click it. The slicer colors now match the pivot table. Step number 7. Drag the Sales ID slicer to the right of the pivot table, placing its upper left corner in cell G3. Okay, get a hold of it right about there. There's G, there's 3, G3. Okay, see figure 5-43, and you can check to make sure that yours looks like the one in the book. All right, on page 311, to filter the pivot table using the Sales ID slicer. Step number 1, press and hold your Control key and click the number 3 button. Okay, so non-adjacent selection, we already have one thing selected, Control, and click. Okay. Now, hold your Control key, and this time we also want to select the number 4. Okay, so now we have 3 things selected, 2, 3, and 4, correct? Click just the number 2. And now only Sales ID number 2 is displayed. Okay, so when you're working with a slicer, you can only click one thing at a time. If you want to click more than one, you have to use your Control key. Okay, and you can click more than one. Now, without my Control key held down, when I click that number 2, I'm back to only having Sales ID 2, okay, which is where we should be right now. At the bottom of page 311, to hide the pivot table field's task pane and rename the pivot table and worksheet, click on the pivot table. Okay, that was easy enough. And that's going to display your pivot table tools contextual tabs on the ribbon, right? Step number 2, click the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. In the Show group, which is way over here on the right-hand side, click the Field List button. Did you see what just happened over here? Okay, The pivot table field's task pane is hidden and won't reappear when a cell on the pivot table is selected. Well, let's go test it. Sure enough, it doesn't show up, does it? Step number 4. In the pivot table group, it's just right here, select the name in the pivot table name box, because it's just pivot table 1, and type sales ID summary. Remember, you can't have any spaces. Did they make that a capital D? Sales ID summary, and make sure you press your enter key when you're finished. Rename this worksheet as Sales ID Summary Pivot Table. So you're going to need to F12 that. So F12, go ahead right now and do that. Now, while you're doing that, let me just warn you that you've got to remember where this is, because you're going to be thinking, oh, well, she said if that disappears, just click on your pivot table. You'll click on your pivot table and it doesn't show back up. Okay, you don't get the whole nice little tab over here. So to get that pane, all we're going to do, see, it's just a toggle switch. It turns it on and off. Okay, at the top of page 312, please read about refreshing a pivot table. To update the June table, or as they like to call it, the June table, and refresh the pivot table, go to the sales data worksheet, and then find the individual sales for 6/3/2017. The amount is $182.55. So we're just going to go to 6/3, which is right here, and the amount of $182.55, which is right there. So I'm in cell E11. See it? Cell E11. Enter $180.55. The sales amount is updated in the table. You're able to turn to the pivot table report to see the effect of this change. Step number 3, go to the sales ID summary pivot table. The amount for individuals on 6/3/2017 is still 182. Right? Do you see it? Still 182.55, which is right there. Okay? And that also affects the grand total, right? Because it's not going to be the same because you changed the number. The pivot table was not automatically updated when the data in its source table changed, so you need to refresh the pivot table. Click on any cell in your pivot table. On the ribbon, click the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. And in the Data group, right here, click the Refresh button. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to watch right here. When we hit Refresh, it's going to update it, okay? You can also use Alt F5 to do that. Now, your pivot table report is updated, and your total rows are also updated, okay? All right, this is probably a good time to reach up and pop save really quick. And we can look at figure 5-44 and compare it to your screen and make sure that your numbers match. All right, on the bottom of page 313, please read about creating different types of pivot tables. And when you get finished with that, flip to 314 and read about creating a recommended pivot table. To create a recommended pivot table, step number 1, go to the sales data worksheet. Select any cell in the Excel table. Okay, so you're already there, but for fun, I'll just click on one. On the ribbon, click the Insert tab. Right there. Step number 3, in the Tables group, right here, click the Recommended Pivot Tables button. The Recommended Pivot Tables dialog box opens. You can select a pivot table from the list of recommended pivot tables. Okay, so you end up with this whole group right here that they recommend, and you can click on each one and take a look. And it's kind of cool because it's done a lot of the formatting for you. It takes your data and gives you alternative layouts. Okay? The sum of amount by day pivot table, this is sum of amount by business, ID, sales, sum of amount by day and business. Okay? And right there is sum of amount by day. So what I did was I just looked at the titles on each one and found this one, which is sum of amount by day, which is the one the book tells you to use, and it's the 6th pivot table. When you've clicked on sum of amount by day, go ahead and click your OK button. On page 315, step number 6, mine didn't work. Now I feel sad, and I'm going to have to try it again. Okay, why didn't I get it? Sum of amount by day. That's what I want. Thank you. I was obviously looking down at my book while I was clicking, and I missed something, but you know what? It's all good now. All right, step number 6. This will teach me to keep my eyes on the screen instead of down at the book. In the pivot table field's task pane, in the values area, click the sum of amount button. Okay, so pivot table field's task pane, right? And in the values area, right here, okay, sum of amount, hit that down pointing arrow right next to it, and click value field settings. All right, click the number format button. You remember it's right there? And we just want to make this currency. So we're going to go currency, OK, and OK. And obviously you know what that does right there. It puts on the dollar signs and gives you 2 decimal places, right? Okay. Step number 10. On the ribbon, click the Pivot Table Tools Design tab. Right there. In the Pivot Table Styles group, click the More button. So here's our Pivot Table Styles. You've done this before. There's our More button. We want Pivot Style Medium 14. Okay, Pivot Style Medium 14. It's right there. It's this green one. Go ahead and click it. Now, rename the worksheet as Daily Sales Pivot Table. Go ahead and do that, and then you're ready to save this file and move on to the next video.